Hello people of the internet, and welcome to the last part in this series on sculpting the King of the Rusted Crown. First of all, thank you to everyone who has been watching, and most of all thank you to my patrons on Patreon for supporting me and making this all possible. If you enjoy watching and want to help me keep these videos coming out, then have a look at the link to my Patreon page. You'll find it in the description below. As we have progressed through this project, I think I've managed to get closer to what I want these videos to eventually be. It would be nice with some better camera equipment, of course, but I think that will happen in due time, hopefully. In this video, I have decided to include several parts that are not sped up, so you can see more accurately what I'm doing with my tool, how I move it across the clay, and what effects it has on the clay. All the work in this video was done without the model, and it represents more or less the last 2 weeks I worked on this project. There's a lot of stuff you can do without the model, providing you have set everything up well with the model. We will have to rely on what was previously taught us and what we implemented by observing the model. Okay, so here we are in real time, and hopefully watching this you'll get an appreciation for why I do speed up the video normally. Sculpting the way I do is not a sprint, it's a very long marathon. That's another good thing I think to keep in mind when attempting something like this, is the fact that it is a marathon, and if you start out sprinting in a real marathon, you won't last very long. So it's the person that's prepared for and plays the long game that will succeed when it comes to sculpture. In most cases, the people who start out super fast end up chasing their sculpture around in a circle, and usually they make it worse. Not that it's usually very good to begin with anyways. Even in my short teaching career, if you can call it that, I've seen this happen to several people. So for everyone who thinks it's important to sculpt fast, I would start reconsidering that. It's not important to sculpt fast, it's important to sculpt well. And sculpting well takes time, just like anything that's worth doing. The money I get from my patrons on Patreon goes towards model time, and as you've seen, I spend a lot of time with the model. On this project, I spent about 70 hours with the model over about 2-3 months. What I hope to accomplish in the future is to make enough so that I can have 2 projects going at once and therefore get more varied content on the channel, instead of spending 2 or 3 or even 4 months on just one project. I've already planned my next 2 sculptures, at least I've planned one, and for that sculpture I plan to spend about 3 months. The plan, for now at least, is to spend about 2/3 of my Patreon income on the model and saving the last 1/3 and get more and better camera equipment so I can shoot from more angles. Hopefully giving you guys a better view of the action and what's going on. So those are some loose thoughts on the future of the channel. If you have ideas or feedback on how to make the videos and the channel better, please leave a comment below or email me if you prefer that. I'd love to hear some feedback from you on what you think could be improved. Okay, so we're finally gonna finish the crown. The design for the crown is a mix of a couple of sculpted crowns I've seen on the internet and the crown on the character that this sculpture was inspired by. More on that later. I have aluminum shim stock as my armature inside the crown, and I've talked about that before, to keep it as geometrical as I can. I went with a very simple crown design, and I've done no research on crowns, so I have no idea if this is some sort of historical design, or if it's a mix of historical design or something completely fantastical. So, if you're an expert on crowns or even just a hobby enthusiast, I'd love to know more about my choice in crown design, so comment below if you have some information on any crowns. I tried using my tool as a way of measuring to keep it as consistent as I could, and in places where my measurements didn't fit well, for whatever reason, I sculpted in a damaged area to hide my errors, or I just got the measurement as close as I could. Here, Tor Larsen, who is a fellow instructor at the Florence Academy of Art and a good friend, and I discuss how I should go about making the mold. Thor is a master mold maker, and it really helps to bounce ideas off each other when planning out a mold. And I'll have a whole series on the mold I made on this piece out in the near future. The chosen design is partially to hide crimes as well. The thick bottom edge makes the crown look thicker than it is and makes it real easy for me to make the connection between the head and the crown look realistic. Plus it adds a decorative element, and I imagine perhaps you would want your crown to be thicker at the bottom so it won't bend and flex. Or maybe you want it to bend and flex, I'm not sure. I mirrored the thick edge along the top of the crown, and again this gave me an opportunity to make the damage to the crown look obvious, with the thick edges breaking off together with the peaks. And it hides the fact that the crown is probably thicker than a crown should be. It had to be thicker because I used clay, and if you apply water-based clay in a very thin layer, it will dry and crack before you know it. I also added some very simple geometrical lines with my drawing knife, or butter knife, just to add some simple decoration. The whole crown is supposed to appear like it's made out of cast iron and have been subjected to time and wear. So a crusty surface was easy enough to make. I just kept my clay application loose and I didn't clean up the surface at all. And I added some dings and damaged areas randomly spread across the crown. The visual inspiration for this sculpture comes from Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls is a video game series that I play occasionally, and I always found the visuals in the game and the setting in the game very interesting. The character which inspired this sculpture is Ludleth of Courland, and he's an important character in the game and one that helps the player by making weapons and armor. Now, he's small of stature and describes himself as a sad cadaver, but he is the only one of the Lords of Cinder who's willing to sacrifice himself to link the fire. All the other Lords of Cinder needs to be persuaded by the player in a violent manner, and therein lies the game. And so there's something heroic to Ludleth of Courland. In the game, he's this tiny character seated on a huge throne. So it's a very cool image, very cool visual. I wonder what stories from our time will become the stories that we create art from in the future. The Bible has of course been one such book that we've created art from, and Dante's Divine Comedy is another great example. Now it probably won't be something as obscure as Dark Souls, a Japanese video game, but who knows? And I do think it's very interesting to create art inspired by the stories that my contemporaries tell. Partly because there's actually only a few overarching storylines to tell, and so while most stories won't last as long as the Bible or Dante's Inferno, the abstract concepts upon which every story is created is eternal and will ring as true in the future as they do now, even if the stories themselves will be forgotten. Okay, so here we have some real-time footage again on sculpting veins. In this case, the biceps vein. Veins are the vessels that carry the blood that keeps us alive, and so representing them on the sculpture adds the feeling of something happening beneath the skin, in the same fashion as I try to give the feeling of bones and muscle beneath the skin. They also add some texture to the surface and some interest, and they're visually very apparent in real life, at least on some people, so I think adding them gives the sculpture another level of realism. I start out by drawing the shape of my vein on my sculpture, and once I like the shape and where it is placed, I add a small sausage of clay. I twist the sausage over itself when putting it down on the surface to give some natural variety in the thickness of the vein. Then it's a fairly simple matter of blending the clay sausage so it becomes the flesh of the arm. I press the clay down first before I go over it with a rake tool and then a loop tool. It's important to come at the vane from different angles when doing this. Like with every other form I model on the sculpture, I lose some edges here and there, and I always step back to observe how the vane looks from a distance. On most people, unless they are super skinny or roided up monsters, the veins are very subtle, so I prefer to err on the side of caution, and I think it's better to have the vein be somewhat undermodeled rather than overmodeled. It should read as part of the whole, and the key word here is underneath the skin. A huge part of sculpting for me is the technical aspect of it. And I don't set out to create art. I set out to create a sculpture. Now, others can decide if my sculptures have enough value to be called art. And because of this, I haven't discussed the thoughts behind the sculpture much in these videos, and I don't want to spend too much time explaining my thoughts behind the work either. Mostly because I'd prefer to let people think for themselves and fill the sculpture with whatever meaning they see fit. My ideas of the sculpture has also changed and morphed as I've worked on it and even after I finished it. So I don't think I can communicate my thoughts without locking myself into whatever interpretation I have at the moment. And I don't think it's necessary. The meaning of a piece of art, if you want to call this art, can change and morph over time, and perhaps it's good to allow it to do so in certain cases at least. I guess the title says a lot. He's a king and he looks old and decrepit, and his crown is rusted and his legs are gone, so he's not mobile anymore, and he's a shadow of his former self. If you asked me to describe what the sculpture is about in one word, I think I would probably say decay. Now perhaps you have some ideas yourself, and I'd love to hear them, so leave them in the comments below. So after about 3 months and about 150 hours of sculpting, the sculpture is finished. Here are some shots of the finished work. If you would like to see more pictures of it, check out my Facebook, Instagram, and website, and you'll find links to all of those in the description below. If you would like a print of the finished picture of the sculpture or a plaster copy of the maquette I made at the beginning of this process, leave a comment below, and if there's some interest, I'll try to get that up on my soon-to-be web store. Now, if you're a wild man and would like a copy of this sculpture in resin or in bronze, please let me know. I'd love to take this piece to its ultimate conclusion. If you want to learn how to sculpt or would like to support my next project, check out the link to my Patreon page in the description below. I hope you enjoyed this video series, subscribe to follow the next project that will come in the near future, and please share this video with your friends. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.